All right, getting everybody in here. Our attendees are piling in. This is fun to watch that ticker go up. Where it stops, we don't
I
know.
don't see what you see, but I'm sure it is exciting.
Yeah. If you click on participants, that number just is, we're at 31,
okay. Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
36. Great. Well, thank you everyone for dialing in and joining today. We'll give folks a few more minutes to get in and get snug. My name is Michael Green, and I serve as the Climate and Energy Director for American Sustainable Business Network. Going to be joined by a few of my colleagues and a few of our close allies and partners today to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. We had a historic win last week and signed on Monday. And that doesn't mean that the work ends. It's actually just the beginning. And we're going to talk a little bit about the process and where we have to go from here. I'm just going to give folks 30 more seconds to get in and make sure all of my panelists are in here as well. Isaac Thomas, Tom said ask for a link, so thanks for making sure he has that. Great. So looks like we're all in here. We're going to let people keep joining, but we'll go ahead and get the show started. So for those of you who are just joining, my name is Michael Green. I serve as Climate and Energy Policy Director at American Sustainable Business Network. Thank you for everyone who is showing up today to learn a little bit more about the IRA and figuring out where we go from here. Just as a little bit of a run of show and what you can anticipate, I'm going to go over some very high level kind of what's in the bill. There's a ton of content out there, a lot of presentations and things that you can read. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to turn that over to the experts that we have here on the call to talk a little bit more about their unique industries or interests and what their takeaways are from the legislation. One of the things, though, that you're going to hear from me quite often this call reiterating is the opportunity for us to partner and get to work here, because the IRA is not just a massive opportunity, but it's a massive investment into climate energy solutions. And in order to make the most of that opportunity, we're going to have to work and partner and work closely together. So I'm going to, after I give an overview, we'll go over to Munira, who will be able to tell us a little bit more about what partnering and working with ASBN, whether you're an affiliate, a member business, or a partner organization, could look like. From there, we're then going to turn it over to I believe, Tom Peterson, who's going to talk about what's in the bill, what are the funding opportunities that are in the bill, how to make the most of those opportunities and follow the process. Then we'll go over to Colton Fagundes, who many of you know, who covers ag policy here at ASBN, Ag and Clean Water, talking about the investments in that space. And then we'll hear from Ben Rubin over at the Carbon Business Council to tell us why they're so excited about this piece of legislation, what it means, and hopefully get into some Q&A at the very end as we wrap up the show here. Feel free to use the chat function to ask questions, and feel free to shoot us anything through the chat as it comes up. And so with that, hand it over to you, Munira, or excuse me, I have to talk first and then I'll hand it over to Munira. And then over to Tom to talk a little bit. Tom, thanks for joining us. So I'm going to cheat a little bit, and our friends over at E2 put out a great report talking about the space that we're in here and the opportunity that the climate tech, clean energy, and this transformative economy that we're building, what it's already done. There's 3.2 million people in the climate tech, renewable energy, however you want to put it, space right now. $3.2 million or excuse me, 3.2 million people, which is really generating hundreds and billions of dollars of economic productivity and opportunity, all here, jobs in the United States of America, which is really exciting. That being said, that's a growth that we've seen year over year. That's happened in blue and red states. The state who saw the largest increase in clean energy jobs over the past year was New Mexico, according to their report. And what was the enabling factor for New Mexico was really ambitious state policy. So, that's a great segue into the opportunity we currently are now sitting in at a federal level with really ambitious federal policy and what that can mean for jobs, not just in New Mexico, but really for jobs across the country. Well, we are one of the fastest growing sectors of the economy. The threat of the climate crisis isn't going away. We're looking at over $150 billion in economic costs last year caused by climate-related extreme weather events, insurance claims, supply chain disruptions, and the like. So we certainly are seeing some great upside as our space continues to grow, but the challenge certainly still persists. So what's in the Inflation Reduction Act that we should be paying the most attention to and be the most excited for? First, to quote a friend of mine, Shail Khan, talked about this being the net gigaton reduction bill. So we can anticipate a net gigaton of carbon emission reductions coming from the bill, 40% or close to 40% by 2030. Really important investments, 369 into energy security and climate change over that 10 years. If you sat in some of our climate energy working group calls, one of the things that we were talking about, and this helps put it in perspective, by 2030, the peak years, and these are years for, numbers for 1 year, we could see up to 129 gigawatts of new solar installed, 31 gigawatts potential of wind per year. If you put that in comparison to last year across the entire grid, we only saw 30 gigawatts of new capacity across all energy sources. So not only is this going to be a bill that creates investment into new technologies in the advancement of new possibilities through things like our national labs, but it's also going to be a massive job creation and energy deployment bill as well. One of the things that we're really interested in and going to be excited to follow. There's, the numbers in here are really quite staggering. $1 billion going into clean heavy duty vehicles, things like school buses, transit, and commercial vehicles, like many of your businesses might be following along, including a 30% investment tax credit for fleet vehicles for businesses to be able to make the transition. So if you're a company on the call today with a large fleet, this is a really great opportunity for you. In manufacturing, one of the things that we're going to continue to follow and create some probably follow-up webinars on, looking at not only the manufacturing investment opportunity in making retrofits to our current manufacturing capacity in the country, but also in order to unlock some of the best incentives around renewable energy in the ITC space. There's going to be benchmarks for what amount of those materials need to be sourced, manufactured, or refined within the US. So that's going to not only create new materials to help beat these or reach these ambitious goals, but again, also creating jobs here in the US, rather than this being a bill that creates direct investment opportunities for maybe actors outside of the country. So, there's again, a lot of wonderful funding opportunities and investments that are going to come from this bill. And we're going to get to work really closely as a community, as an organization, to try and capitalize on that. And what that really means is continuing to engage with ASBN, And so I want to hand it over to Munira to talk a little bit about her role, and also because that will be the friendly face that you get to speak with when you do engage with us over at American Sustainable Business Network. Munira?
Thanks for teeing me up, Michael. My name is Munira Ahmed, and I am the Senior Manager of Engagement here at ASBN. I work very closely with all of our state affiliates and our association members. I actually see a few names that I recognize here. So shout out to Texas Sustainable Business Network and Sustainable Business Network of Massachusetts for joining the call. And I basically want to make sure that all of our policy actions and items of note that are happening on the ASBN side are able to, we have more visibility for them, for our state members. And regionally, we also want to know what is happening on their end as well that we can uplift and support. I work to find various ways of basically just supporting a deeper relationship with our state and association members, and giving them opportunities as well to provide any feedback on specific policy actions that we are actively campaigning for or considering campaigning for. We have sign-on opportunities, fly-in opportunities. It's very helpful to know what can be used to basically use a model for other states as well. And we've done that in the past, especially via our working groups. We have a very robust array of working groups. Our policy director for our regenerative agriculture working group, Colton, is on this call. And we also have a very new one, Transforming Ownership for Social Justice. Michael Green, who we have on this call, heads up our climate and energy. And the focus areas are very vast, and they allow the opportunity for different industries as well to share their insights and inputs, which is always helpful when we put together our memos and comments. And we welcome you to also share any news that would be helpful for us to circulate in our monthly newsletter or on our social media. So we work to amplify as much as possible all of the great work that is happening across our associations and states. And yeah, we just want to encourage as many authentic conversations as possible. We also do an annual conference at the end of the year where we can all convene in person. We did one last December in San Diego, and that will be where this year's is as well. And we're really excited about that. But yeah, I just didn't want to take too much time, but give a little light into that. So I'll just pass it back to you, Michael. I'm going to drop my email if it's okay in the chat. So if
Perfect. That's what I was going to ask, is how can they reach you?
Yeah, I'm going to share my email.
Wonderful. Great. And so, one of the things that we are going to be trying to put information out to our network as much as possible is talking about the process that this funding and opportunities are going to go through. And we have Tom Peterson, who's going to be able to help us understand and translate this a little bit. Tom is the founder and CEO for the Center of Climate Strategies. He has served as a senior advisor on climate change task force at the White House, and also I don't know how he fits it into his schedule, but is a professor at Johns Hopkins. Tom, I know you're actually at another conference today. So thank you for stepping literally outside, it looks like, to chat with us a little bit, but we'll hand it over to you, sir. Thank you.
Well, Mike, thanks so much. And let me first check my audio, if you can hear me okay. And my apologies if there's a little bit of the trees here, and I see some power company guys moving in on me in the distance. So I'll stay flexible about that. But if there's any audio difficulties, let me know. I wanted to share a little bit with you about the basic structure of the Inflation Reduction Act and where that goes in terms of your engagement and opportunity. A little bit of background on it. I think the punchline for this is the old saying that you have to shake the tree to get the plum. This is really the opportunity and the time to be proactive and to go after these funds. And they're kind of in a variety of different places, but it's not a good time to be passive and to count on things coming your way as an entitlement or a pure formula approach. So this is really the time to roll up the sleeves and be proactive. It's really geared around that. I guess to step back just a moment, I started working on climate change policy in the early 1990s, and in the mid 1990s was in the US Senate working for Joe Lieberman, and that was when he got his start on climate change back in the Kyoto Protocol period, and have been full-time involved on the climate change issue really since that time, including my next position was with the White House Climate Change Task Force working in the Clinton administration. So I've seen a lot of developments in climate change policy globally and in the United States over the years. That includes a lot of work at the US state level. So my organization was founded, I founded it all the way back in 2004, specifically to help government and stakeholders work together to develop solutions to climate change, and to focus initially at the state level to work with governors to bring their stakeholders together in these open, formal consensus building procedures to put together comprehensive climate action plans. New Mexico was one of the first states that we did that in, all the way back to, I guess it was 2006. And we helped then Governor Richardson and his team put together that state's first climate action plan. And so, Mike, I'm just really pleased to hear that the evolution forward of that has played a role at helping to galvanize these opportunities. That's precisely the intent of these comprehensive action planning processes, is to not only improve the enabling environment, but to get really specific about what can be done in all of the different sectors to not only get the junk out of the air and reduce the underlying risks associated with climate change, but make economic improvements and equity improvements. And there has been a long evolution in the United States of those kinds of procedures. Well over half of our states have put together comprehensive climate action plans in this comprehensive, multi-objective, stakeholder-based format that have really played a contributing role. And that message was not lost on the rest of the world. I mentioned I started out working on the issue during the Kyoto Protocol, which has been characterized more as a top-down approach the United Nations was trying to take, but it was ultimately overtaken after about 20 years of evolution by the Paris Agreement, which was entirely consistent with the experience among US states and other jurisdictions worldwide, which was more of a bottom-up participatory approach and more diversified in terms of creating a portfolio of policy actions in all of the different economic sectors. So the Paris Agreement was, in my opinion, and has been the biggest policy development event in the 27 years that I've been working on this issue. And the second biggest, which is, I think, a kissing cousin to it, is the Inflation Reduction Act. And the reason I say that is that while the Paris Agreement was crucial in terms of creating a platform and a mechanism for policy development, it doesn't self-implement. Every single one of the specific policy measures that comes out of the exercise to put together the nationally determined contributions at the national level or their equivalent at the state and local level, like a comprehensive climate action plan, has to have governance actions, rules, regulations, guidance, as well as money in order for it to be successfully implemented. And it's a tall order, because when you look at the level of funding that is needed to implement our climate change goals and the policy measures behind them at scale, the numbers are extremely large. And they are so large that it's clear that governments under business as usual conditions the public sector simply can't finance all the work that needs to be done. Ultimately, the private sector is going to have to step up to the plate and be responsible for the lion's share of financing behind these technologies and practices that have to be adopted in all the different sectors. So from where we stand today, we need to figure out how to get there from here. And the getting there from here involves a ratio of probably 8 or 10 to 1 in terms of private funds that will leverage or be matched to public funds. The Inflation Reduction Act builds that bridge, or a really significant piece of it, in addition to the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, or bipartisan infrastructure law that precedes it. They really now are stimulating opportunities for the private sector to step in and begin this process. They're also stimulating government agencies at all levels of government to begin taking earnest steps towards actual implementation and providing the level of funds and the mechanisms to do that at scale. So this is an enormous development because I think it is not so well appreciated, the scale at which these activities need to take place. It's been so often that governments and other members of the stakeholder community have really thought about climate change as something we fix by doing projects, and we really can't. We have to standardize and aggregate projects at a very broad scale in order for them to get the job done. Let me just give you a quick example, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the federal funding. So we are helping the state of Maryland right now map federal funds to the policy actions that are identified in its comprehensive plan. And they did an update to it called Climate Solutions Now, but prior to that, it was the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act, and it covers all the different sectors. If you look in Maryland just at the transportation sector and its slice of the pie that is needed for reductions to meet statewide targets, the state has identified, they think, something on the order of about $14 billion in commitments to these programs. But in order to fully attain the transportation goals for climate change, it needs to mobilize somewhere between 57 and 67 billion of additional funding. If you slide over to the energy sector and then over to the building sectors, it's at least the same amount of money for those sectors. And then you also have to move over to agriculture and forestry and waste. I mean, what was the old saying Eb Dirksen had years ago? $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Pretty soon you're talking real money. We're really talking about mobilizing funds at a very astonishing scale, and that is the simple reality. The other reality is the timing. I think folks have been kind of geared to thinking that, okay, so this all can stretch out over the next 30 years or so in order to get the job done. Not quite. The reality, when you look at the math, is that by 2030, in order to be definably on the pathway to meet mid-century goals, the programs that are required to do that need to be already in place and already achieving reductions at scale for that period. And this is 2022 now. Well, okay, we've got 8 years. It gives us 7 3/4 years not to worry about it. Then we can get in action. That's not right either. You think about the amount of time it takes to get a new windmill in place, to get a new automobile in the fleet, to get a building rebuilt, whatever. There's a lot of lag time. And so the reality in state legislatures and in executive branches across the country right now is they're scrambling for all purposes to put in things that will come true by 2030. So this federal legislation is really in the nick of time to help them with that, because we've got to move these new programs into place at full funding levels and full scale, really in the next couple of years, such that by 2030, we're actually bringing these reductions in place to meet these reduction pathways. Well, how does this happen? First, let me just say that let me comment on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And I guess I'll shorthand that, maybe going forward, calling it the bipartisan infrastructure law. When you look at that law, there's quite a bit of funding there that can be used for carbon reduction purposes and jointly to achieve economic improvements and environmental justice. And I'll talk a little bit more about those provisions in a moment. But the truth is that only a small portion of those funds mandatorily have to be used for climate mitigation. The legislation encourages funding to be used for that purpose, but does not require it. And you run the math, and the Rhodium Group did a nice analysis for the Georgetown Climate Center that you can hit on the web and call up that'll show this. The truth is there's a 50% chance this thing blows up in our face and goes the wrong direction, because if those funds are spent on conventional highway expansion and other transportation and energy uses, they actually increase emissions. States and localities have the opportunity to use them more creatively and constructively for low carbon purposes, but it is not a given. And they need just a ton of help doing that, being encouraged to doing it, being supported, if not required, in doing it. And this is an opportunity for state legislatures to proactively weigh in as well to ensure that those funds are used for constructive purposes and not regressive purposes with regards to emissions. But the plus and minus around the emissions reduction side of that act is, there's a plus side where emissions go up and an equal probability they go down. And we've got a lot of work to do to make sure they head the right direction there. But even the plus and minus, while it is significant and can be highly significant for particular programs at a national scale, isn't big enough to get the job done. So, and again, I'd go to that Georgetown analysis by the Rhodium Group and some other groups, did similar work to see what that curve looks like. When you compare that to the Inflation Reduction Act, the difference is dramatic. So if you look at the trajectory of United States emissions, and then you look at the shift downward that is forecasted through full implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, I think Mike mentioned before a 40% reduction figure. It is a very, very large drop, a very, very large wedge. And the programs are designed to do that mandatorily. In other words, these are specifically geared towards supporting technologies and practices that are low carbon in nature and not to support things that head in the other direction. They're also specifically configured to support actions that have been found repeatedly with proper implementation to have net economic expansion when they are implemented. And they also have the ability to target disadvantaged communities, low and moderate income, and other sensitive populations. And so this is structured to accomplish these things. And it's a very, very big gap that it can close in terms of emissions reduction. So the bipartisan infrastructure law is structured to do that through formula funds and competitive grants predominantly. The Inflation Reduction Act does include loans and grants. I think that's I think the hard number on this is 369 billion is in the Inflation Reduction Act for climate change reduction activities. And a slice of that, but not the biggest slice by any stretch, are loans and grants. Those loans and grants are going to go back to the Department of Energy and the Department of Transportation, USDA, and other federal agencies to go right into the grant and loan programs that are part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. And the agencies will be coming for guidance around that. And presumably those will show up as competitive grant mechanisms and loans, et cetera. But the really big chunk of change here, 300 billion chunk of change kind of thing, are the tax credits. Now, let me just note there's another chunk, 27 billion, that is for a national accelerator program. This is to create a first ever independent national green bank that will be used to stimulate and accelerate state level green banking efforts. And that's a bit of a shorthand because it's really broader than green banking. It's investment banking for the clean energy sector. But going back to the tax credits, first off, as you guys probably know, what the bill includes, there's a lot of well-known tax credits that have been re-upped and plussed. right? And then given a little bit of sweeteners here and there. So the investment tax credit, for instance, now has a 10% bonus for targeting to disadvantaged communities. And let me just say parenthetically, the loan and grant programs have some programs that are specifically identified for environmental justice investments. They're very highly targeted for that purpose. Everything else can be targeted as well. But going back to the tax credits, there's a lot of familiar territory there. Tax credits have been a really critical part of economic expansion efforts in the United States and targeted policy development and targeted economic expansion. And in this case, it's being targeted to the expansion of the clean energy sector and the sustainable resource sector. But something new has been added, and that is what is called a direct payment option. What is the direct payment option? It means that a non-taxable entity, a tax-exempt entity, now can take advantage of tax credits even though it doesn't pay taxes. And it does that functionally by overpaying taxes, by filing and overpaying and then being paid directly a reimbursement by Treasury, about a 30% level, which is equivalent to the tax credit for the qualified expenditures that they make. So if you're a county, if you're a state, if you're a church, if you're an NGO, if you're a non-governmental community organization that doesn't pay taxes, now you can participate in the tax credit system through the direct payment option. Homeowners can do this as well. So we've now opened this tax code so it's not just for rich people, it's not just for rich corporations, it's for everybody. And incredible wide open opportunity. You'll see in the act breakdowns of the different areas that the tax credits cover. And in terms of timing, we'll see what gets announced. But my current understanding is that as of the signature, which I believe occurred yesterday, Treasury has 45 days to issue guidelines on opening the tax credits and direct payment options. And the expectation is that those guidelines will be just a first series followed by more later, but they will include two very crucial requirements, eligibility requirements. One will be for domestic content, which I think Mike mentioned. There will be spellouts here for ensuring that we have a Buy America approach in the supply chain for these things. And that has a very pronounced effect on local economic development and support for disadvantaged communities and low and moderate income. It keeps the money at home. It also has a labor requirement. And the labor requirement will depend a little bit on which particular tax credit area we're talking about, but in some cases it requires unionization. In some cases it requires apprenticeship programs. And it is likely to have diversity requirements for workforce that are gender-based and possibly based on other criteria. We'll see, but you can expect that there will be domestic content and labor requirements for the tax credits in this first set of guidelines that are issued. Again, I just want to underscore that this new direct payment option opens the door to a wide range of entities who haven't been able to play in the tax credit and tax equity world before. And it's a big one. And now is the time to be figuring out how to do that. Let me comment real briefly on the accelerator program, and then maybe I'll stop and we can open for questions. But so the accelerator program, it's 27 billion, but I think 7 billion is sliced off to go to EPA, and the remainder goes to an independent National Green Bank mechanism. The Coalition for Green Banking, I believe, is actually going to manage that. That will be providing then funding to equivalent state entities for investments in projects that they line up, projects or programs that are eligible within it that will follow similar criteria. And this is another one of these early bird gets the worm kind of things where it's just going to be demand driven. It's not going to be formula driven. Let's just say Massachusetts gets to the stage where it has a green banking mechanism that can be used for this purpose. That doesn't mean that Massachusetts will get some formulaic share of this. It will have to compete with all 50 states and demonstrate that it has a pipeline of ready projects for investments through this mechanism. Part of what will be happening also is that funding is designed to actually build capacity for these mechanisms so that they can engage in private sector leveraging, private sector funds. And this goes back to the beginning of my comments here, where the intent of this legislation is to build a bridge to the long term, where we are enabling the private sector to start stepping in and providing debt, equity, gifts, and grants in addition to the public funds, and leverage these things through mechanisms that bring sources and uses together and bring blended finance together so that we have a long-term platform for climate finance in the United States. Tremendous opportunity, but as you can imagine, a lot of capacity building, a lot of readiness is needed, and there will be a lot of time work needed around all of these things. So Mike, maybe I'll stop there. It's a bit of a brain dump, and I know folks probably have lots of questions and thoughts they'd like to contribute, and I'm happy to add anything else or respond where it would be helpful.
Yeah, well, people can definitely use the Q&A function here to type in their questions, and Tom, I can read them out as they come in. But I'm just going to recap, and then I'm going to actually hand it to Colton to say a few words as those questions continue to come in. First, states and organizations who are looking to make the most of this opportunity need to have a plan in place with hard numbers and budgets and some rigorous strategy in order to make the most of the funding and opportunity. And states, it sounds like Tom, as he said, are moving quickly to make the most of this. The $369 billion amount keeps coming up. Again, that's going to go through loans and grants, but really the heaviest opportunity is going to be in the tax incentive and tax credit opportunity. It's going to have a wide range of opportunities. One reason, because it's technology agnostic in comparison to maybe previous strategies, which dictated specifically how many credits could be spent on certain types of technology or at certain types of companies. So lifting those caps, lifting those restrictions, and opening up to new technologies and new players in the marketplace is a really exciting opportunity, especially for our businesses. So with that, let me pass it over to Colton. And Colton, I think you have something that you're going to share, and I think you have the capacity to do that. So let me hand it over to you, sir.
Thanks, Michael. And thank you, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. Just to have a single slide here, just to kind of help us walk through some of the numbers I'm going to talk about. So to introduce myself briefly, Colton Fagundes. I'm with ASBN, where I direct our regenerative agriculture and our clean water initiatives. And as you may already be aware, and as we've discussed a little today, there's significant funding for agriculture in the Inflation Reduction Act. What the administration and what Congress has been calling climate smart agriculture. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that new funding, how it overlaps with regenerative agriculture and sort of the goals of regenerative agriculture as we see it as at ASBN and amongst our movement partners. And I will try to be brief because I know we covered a lot today. So a lot of numbers here. About 38 billion to 40 billion, depending on how you look at it, total for climate smart agriculture in the package. A little bit lower than what was originally in the Build Back Better Act, but still very good numbers, not actually major cuts at all, especially to the sort of the conservation part of it. And so we'll start with that. On the left side here, we have $20 billion for USDA conservation programs. These are very popular programs at the USDA, especially the first two, the environmental qualities incentives, and actually I got their third, the conservation stewardship program. Those are the main ones that we work with in the regenerative agriculture community. And so these programs currently are overprescribed about 3 to 1. And they voluntary incentives programs to help farmers adopt various conservation practices, such as these can include things like cover crops, crop rotations, decreasing tillage, so forth. A lot of practices that overlap with what we consider regenerative agriculture and practices to build soil health. Unfortunately, a lot of these programs also have funded practices in the past that didn't have so much to do with climate and didn't have so much to do with what we consider regenerative agriculture. A lot of structural practices, such as irrigation, building, sometimes building ponds, dams, also funding towards large-scale concentrated animal feeding operations from newer lagoons and other sort of waste management and so forth. Luckily, what we were able to get included and what Congress is able to pass in this package was some guardrails on the funding that directs the USDA to ensure that the programs are going towards addressing climate issues. And specifically, I actually have the language here. Directly, the funding is to be directed towards improving soil carbon, reducing nitrogen losses, reducing, capturing, avoiding, or sequestering carbon dioxide and methane, or nitrous oxide emissions associated with agricultural production. So this is a good step in the right direction. So this funding will actually be more targeted than it generally has been at the USDA in the past. Unfortunately, there's still, that wasn't quite what a lot of us wanted to see in the regenerative agriculture community, didn't quite go far enough. Specifically, that still allows funding to go towards large-scale polluting concentrated animal feeding operations, to adopt waste management and practices in methane digesters, which many believe that really the EPA should just be enforcing them to adopt these technologies anyways to reduce their environmental and climate impacts. But luckily, there will be quite a bit of funding to go towards actually incentivizing farmers to improve their soil health, which in result will reduce emissions, reduce nitrogen fertilizer use, and also help sequester carbon dioxide. This also was important because moving forward in the 2023 Farm Bill, there will be an opportunity to even further improve these programs. And there's also an opportunity to engage the USDA to make these programs improved. But what we do not see in the Farm Bill is typically an opportunity for huge increases to the funding for these programs, because the Farm Bill is a bipartisan package. So this was really one of the main opportunities we had to see huge increases for these programs that are sort of the flagship existing USDA programs for promoting regenerative agricultural and soil health practices. Also important, conservation technical assistance will be hugely important. More money could have likely been used there. Maybe we can secure more in the future to really just provide outreach, technical assistance and training to farmers, and even getting them enrolled in these programs. A lot of farmers aren't really aware of the opportunities that exist in these programs. So moving forward, I'm just going to go over the middle one, skip over the last section there. But on agricultural credit, there's about $6 billion, $3.1 billion for debt forgiveness for distressed borrowers. This is sort of seen as a replacement to the debt relief for farmers of color that was passed in the COVID reconciliation package by Democrats last year, which got blocked in the courts. This was sort of promoted as an alternative. There is some concern amongst some of our farmer allies that work with marginalized groups that this funding does not exactly overlap with the funding that did get blocked in the courts. But hopefully it will overlap significantly. There's sort of mixed feelings. Some groups are more excited, some are a little cautious, because there is language in the text that also sort of replaced that original debt relief for farmers of color. So it's going to really prohibit, sort of bring an end to those court cases and really sort of end the fight from farmer groups to try to actually get that funding that was promised. But still, there will be funding released. There's also $2.9 billion for underserved farmers and various other sources of assistance, including $2.2 billion for financial assistance for those that can prove discrimination. Farmers will have to show paperwork or some argue some sort of other proof to access this funding, but it is still significant. And then on the last side, quite a bit of funding for renewable energy projects. I honestly am less familiar with the USDA rural energy project programs, so I won't speak to those, but those numbers are there for your reference. And I think that's a good overcap, Cindy.
Great. Thank you so much, Colton. And, a couple of thoughts, there's a lot of opportunity for climate smart agriculture coming into this. And I think it also cues us up at ASBN to continue to work on the Farm Bill and a few other critical pieces of legislation that are coming down the pipeline. So if you're interested in that, or any of our climate ag and clean water work, please do reach out to Colton. So we're going to go over to Ben Rubin. Ben's the founder of the Carbon Business Council and also a research fellow with the Institute of Carbon Removal, which I did not know. Many of you also may be familiar with Ben because of his great work over the last few years with Climate Nexus as well. So Ben, tell us a little bit about why the Carbon Business Council is so excited about this piece of legislation, and hand it over to you, sir. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks so much for having me on the panel, Michael. And yeah, great to be here. Appreciate everybody joining for your interest in hearing more about this landmark moment, and excellent to be hearing from the other panelists as well, filled with great insights and information. As Mike was saying, the Carbon Business Council we're proud to be a member of ASBN and work together in this. It was great to hear Colton's remarks. Our members are both focused on nature-based solutions, technological solutions, ocean-based, and so we're certainly excited about the ag provisions that Colton was just walking through. I think both to zoom out and then to zoom in, the IRA, it's great news for climate and climate tech overall, in all of the different areas that we've been hearing about from Tom and Colton and Michael, just across the board. I think not only because of what the funding and the tax incentives provide from the federal government, but also because of the market signals this will give to the private sector, increased investment coming from VCs, investors, more assurance that the US is staying the course on climate change. And so just today, Breakthrough Energy came out with an estimate that the IRA was likely to help spur the creation of 1,000 new companies. Many companies in the Carbon Business Council are startups, are entrepreneurs, are innovators. And so just to see this explosion of innovation that the IRA has triggered in the private sector, we think that's great news. And so you've heard a little bit about what's taking place on the ag and nature-based side of the equation. I want to briefly touch on some of the tax incentives that have been created for carbon management. And this is in 45Q. There were overhauls to 45Q that helped double the tax incentive for removing CO2 from the atmosphere with direct air capture. So that is going as a result of the IRA, that is now going from where it was at $50 a ton, and that is going up significantly to $180 a ton for CO2 storage, or $130 a ton for utilization. And so seeing that increase in finance is great. There's a number of other provisions in the 45Q tax incentive that help increase eligibility. There's a direct pay option that Tom was talking about. There's a different criteria threshold that will help enable more startups to participate in that 45Q tax credit. And so we think it's great to see the work happening on both 45Q, the technological and carbon on direct air capture utilization side of the equation, the nature-based solutions that Colton was talking about, and then just all the provisions in climate tech overall. So those are just a couple of top line updates for me on reasons that we're excited, and want to highlight too, Tom was getting at this also, this really built on more and more leadership coming from the federal government. We're pleased to see that carbon management in particular has been emerging as a bipartisan solution. The CHIPS Act that was passed just a few weeks ago has $1 billion earmarked for carbon removal R&D. And so really just seeing this increase in funding, seeing the increased attention on carbon removal, we think it's great. And we also think it's great recognizing that removal needs to work in tandem with the important work of mitigation and all of the very important provisions that we've been hearing about around electric vehicles, renewable energy, grid transformations, and the rest. So that's a little bit on the removals carbon management side of the equation. And Mike, I will turn it back to you for anything that comes next.
Well, thank you so much, Ben. We got a couple of questions here that came into the chat while you guys were presenting. And one of the things that I wanted to just start with, it was a question that was for Colton on biochar projects. And maybe, Ben, you might have something to say. I think biochar kind of fits within your world and members as well. Anything in there or biochar was specifically called out around investment opportunities in the IRA?
As far as I didn't see biochar called out specifically at all. I do believe biochar can be, there is some funding for projects under the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is the programs that I mentioned on the left on my presentation for biochar. It does look like, and I should already know this, but biochar is a fund recognized practice under the NRCS. So that does mean, and do not take my word for this, but I believe you can receive funding under these programs for biochar use. Farmers can.
And sorry, NRCS?
Sorry, NRCS is the Natural Resource Conservation Service at the USDA, which is responsible for implementing all those conservation programs I talked about.
Cool, awesome. Also, there's a question specifically related to fuel cells. I think that the bill calls out zero carbon energy and technologies are able to take and make the most of the production and investment tax credits that are within the bill. So from my understanding, those would both count for those opportunities, but maybe just if any of the panelists have a other idea or anything else on that. Anyone aware of fuel cell technology in the IRA? Okay. The next question here that we got that came in, and please do feel free to continue to use the chat or the Q&A function here. Asking what the IRA means for public companies in climate-related goals. Do you think that this will drive company investment in renewable energy? This is coming from Lindsay Frost. That's a great question. Do we think the IRA is going to drive more investment? Well, here's the thing. First, there is, of course, like the very literal specific kind of piece where there's a lot that looks at government procurement within the bill and how the US is going through with its buy clean commitments. Those policies and programs were always put in place and shaped with the idea that they would spur further investment and further market maturity within the private sector. So, from my perspective, is the IRA going to drive company investment in renewable energy? I don't think across the board it's going to be the case, but the companies who are following the conversation, who are preparing themselves for the next new age group of workforce that wants to work with companies who are fueled by clean electricity and having positive impact on the planet, looking at their market and how consumers are looking for products with sustainable impacts. I think that companies very much so should take the advantage. There's plenty of economic drivers and opportunities for why they should be making investments into renewable energy. But now we have even greater incentive programs available really across the board, as Tom was saying, for different types of technologies and different types of businesses. There's some flexibility around the production tax credit versus the investment tax credit, depending on whether or not you want that investment or incentive upfront or on the tail end of the project as you're investing in. So there's a lot of different ways that companies will be able to mobilize these opportunities quite flexibly as well. But maybe just check in with Tom or any of the other panelists if they have anything else to offer on, do we think that this bill is going to drive company investment into renewable energy and clean technologies?
Let me maybe offer a thought, and I will go, Michael, to some assessment work that was done in Massachusetts to tee this off a couple of years ago, which was taking a hard look at where clean energy and climate change and emissions reductions need to come from in the long term. The conclusion was that about 40% of that is going to be on the generation side, but about 60% is on the end use side. And it's all about consumers and households and the decisions they make on the products they choose to buy and install and use in their buildings and that they use for mobility purposes. And what this bill does is it makes the purchase of those end use technologies, in addition to the generation technologies, more affordable. It gets the price tag down on these things. And it would seem that that would encourage new product development that would be consistent, with these low carbon products that can be initially advantaged by the incentives in this bill, but then hopefully gain market share and transition over to become dominant products in the marketplace in the future. So if you're a product developer, you really should be thinking pretty seriously about how you build and distribute products that are consistent with them and take advantage of this emerging clean energy market that's now gotten a pretty big jump start through this legislation. You ought to be, I think, assuming that you're going to have a lot of company and a lot of competition as you do it. So you don't want to get caught asleep at the wheel. And, and I have an MBA and was in a product development track. And I'm just so hopeful that what we will start to see is a migration into the business sector for product development and then the financing around that incorporates carbon reduction as one of the attributes of design and attributes of performance. It's all kind of sitting there waiting to happen through this legislation. We're seeing all the policy signals, but this time it really gives us a hard cash stipend to play with as a part of pushing all of that forward. I'm going to guess this doesn't necessarily happen automatically and by itself. I'm going to guess that other partners are going to need to help the business community step through the door and make this happen now that they've got the wherewithal to do it.
Thank you for that answer, Tom. Well, we're just getting up to the top of the hour here. I'm going to try and respond to some of these questions as they're in the chat. Colton, there's a few here on ag that maybe you could help me out on. One of the last ones was talking about, the last question here from Dior is, what's the procurement process going to look like? That's something that we're going to be following closely. There is funding set aside or an added incentive set aside for prevailing wages offered on the manufacturing investments that exist. But we certainly will let our partners and our affiliates and members know as funding opportunities come up that maybe we're targeting or looking for partners on. So with that, thank you, everyone. We're at the top of the hour. I appreciate it. Maybe a virtual round of applause. You guys can't see the attendees, but they're all doing this as well for you. Appreciate the time and energy. Ben, Tom, Colton, everyone reach out to Munira to get further engaged and involved, and we'll talk to you guys soon. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Bye-bye, guys.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.